Any familiar faces, so that's good. For those of you who are already here, I may apologize. I will say the few introductory words that I already said at 9 o'clock in the morning. We thought about doing another what if session or two sessions at the conference this year, together with Lars Bernhard from the University of Dresden and my colleagues Wanda, Robert and Robin. I think we're continuing a nice tradition that Ulla and colleagues started last year at the conference. So why are we doing this what if workshops and sessions? We've seen this week that Inspire implementation is really progressing across the EU. We're really seeing more and more data really becoming available, and people actually trying to use those data to put together applications, to put together cross-border, national, European data sets, and so on. So I think really we're making good progress in the implementation. On the other hand, we have a number of new technologies that are transforming our society, our economy, and those of you who were in the plenary yesterday evening saw some good examples on what's actually happening in the car industry, in the data analytics space, also talking to citizens and making them collect data as well. So there's a number of things that are happening in parallel to Inspire that we really should be taking into account and see what implications and what opportunities they may have for Inspire. So we thought we should really look at, take a step back and think about what Inspire would look like if we could redesign it today to integrate new data sources coming from sensors, coming from citizens, exploiting new ICT opportunities, cloud computing, the Internet of Things, platforms, mobile computing, and so on. And we thought a good time horizon could be 10 to 15 years, 20 years from now, maybe, to look at that. So the story so far, as I said, Ulla, John, Mark started a workshop, organized a workshop last year that was called What If We Didn't Have Inspire? That was quite interesting and well attended, and I think to sum up in one line that the outcome was that actually we would do it again, more or less in the same way. Maybe we would slightly do things differently, but by and large we would still do something like Inspire. So to follow up from that, we organized another workshop at the OGC meeting in Delft in March this year, that was looking into some more detailed questions, trying to think what we would maybe do differently. And again, there were not really any big revolutionary ideas saying we should have to throw it all away and do something completely different. But at the same time, people said, okay, we don't really know what the future will bring, so the main thing really for the infrastructure is that it should be flexible and to allow for a technological change, but to still at the same time try and give some continuity and some stability over time. At the same time, we said, okay, we don't really want to, if we change something, it should be clear that that actually works. So it's important not to do any theoretical or to base changes on theoretical exercises, but to really base them on things that have been proven to work and experiment with new proposals. And last but not least, we said, okay, it's important to define the success factors of the infrastructure, and that should clearly not just be compliance. We shouldn't be doing the infrastructure just to be compliant with it, but we should define what it means to have a good infrastructure so that we know whether the direction that we're going into is the right one. So in this workshop, these sessions, we really want to discuss 5 topics that came out of the OGC workshops. The first one was how do we make sure that the infrastructure is resilient and flexible enough to deal with the changing boundary conditions. How do can we make sure that the infrastructure can include non-administrative data providers, industry, citizens, researchers, NGOs, and so on? How can we define success for Inspire? How do we really get better involved with application developers? How do we make sure that they know that our data exists? How do we make sure that they can easily use it, and so on? And last but not least, how do we do this experimentation? How could that work in practice? So your task today is basically to think widely and wildly, but to basically take the current status of the infrastructure into account. So don't say we throw it all away and we do it in a completely different way. But in the first step, think widely, think out of the box, and then try and apply it to what that could mean for the evolution of the infrastructure. So we don't want revolution, as Lars said in the first session. We want an evolution. We will have 3 presentations of 5 minutes each, and we'll try and be strict with the 5 minutes, because before people were a bit lengthy, so we didn't have so much time to discuss. So we'll try and keep the time. And then break into groups, so you can choose one of the 3 presenters to go in the 3 corners of the room, and then discuss with them 3 things: a vision for Inspire in 2025, 2030, 2 or 3 or 4 recommendations on what things we should be starting to do, what we should be reinforcing that we're already doing, or maybe things that we should be doing less because it's not so relevant anymore. Preferably based on real-world experience. So don't just come up with theoretical exercises, but something that that works in your country, maybe in a project at least, would be useful. And then we didn't get to that, but if you manage to get to that, it would be great to see what concrete next steps or quick wins we could work on. Organize some workshops, propose some activities for the maintenance and implementation work program, for research proposals, research agendas, pilots, testbeds, or other things that you could come up with. What we're going to do with all of that, we will of course try and bring whatever comes out of this session to the MIG, so the Maintenance Implementation Group, and see whether we can do something concrete with the member states on that, and also with the wider stakeholder community. But we will also try and develop a paper that we will publish in the International Journal of SDI Research, basically summarizing the findings from this workshop. So these are the 2 things, and we already said in the first group that we'll try and stay in touch with you if you're interested to continue the discussion online. So if you're interested to continue the discussion, I'll hand around a paper. If you put your email in there, we'll keep you in the loop for the follow-up activities as well. Okay, that's it. Any questions for the setup? All clear? Okay. Then I will maybe just start myself.
Keep the time.
Yes? Okay, so my topic today is really what if we wanted to more actively involve users in the evolution of Inspire. First thing that we're struggling with, I think, is knowing who they are. There's different types of users, I think. We often talk about end users, but are these really the ones that we should be focusing on? Or is it more the solution providers, those people that are building applications that are then being used by end users? Or are there maybe other types of users as well? So it's more the people, the hackers on the top right, or is it more the people in the public administrations or in the offices that or businesses that we should be looking at? How do we keep track of users? That actually came up in one of the discussions earlier. If we publish data openly or through services, often we don't really know who is actually using our data. How do we keep track of them? How do we get their feedback as well? And where do we find them if we want their feedback? Do they come to the Inspire conference? I don't think so, really. Not many of them, at least. And how do we talk to them? And because often when we talk in our Inspire speak, many of the, let's say, the users, be they developers or be they end users in public administrations or in DG environments, they don't really understand what we're talking about. The second one is how do we really work on this feedback process? How do we simplify the feedback channels? I mean, we have a number of things like the thematic clusters where people can leave us feedback, but in a way we have the feeling that it's not really working so well. At least we're not reaching the real users that we should be talking to. How do we make the then when they provide feedback? How do we take it more? How can we ensure that the maintenance and implementation process more easily takes this feedback into account? And are there any intermediaries that could help us to collect, interpret, and channel user needs? So maybe we need some people or some organizations that could help us with doing this. And I put here a few pictures of platforms like Amazon or Booking.com or Google Maps, where they really manage to really well integrate the user feedback. So maybe there's something that we can learn from these platforms. What are the added benefits of Inspire? Because I think that is one of the things we need to tell our users. What are the features that Inspire can offer that national solutions cannot? Some of you may have seen the presentations from my colleague Jiri in the workshop session or in the posters, where we did some kind of data mining on the metadata that we get in the GeoPortal. Maybe that is actually something that Inspire can offer, but maybe there's other things that we can do. Again, what can we learn from other platforms like Amazon, like Booking.com, and how do we implement such features that give us additional benefits over national solutions? Who's willing to pay? That might be another question. Do we have a pay per use for every time you access data or you use the data, you pay something? Or do we just say this should be an open service that is funded by the public and made available to the public? That means the taxpayer pays. Do we need to have more standardized tools to help people to make people pay or make licenses more easily available? That could be another thing that we could discuss. And then last but not least, how can we showcase the benefits? I think to really involve users better, we need to really have convincing use cases. What could such applications look like? What are the barriers that we still need to overcome to come up to these kind of easy showcase applications in something that everybody, even if they're from a different domain, could understand? Who are the key users and the drivers for such an implement, or how can we make users of such applications really a driver for the implementation? So that's it for me, and a lot of questions that I would like to discuss, and I'm looking forward to doing that in the group. Thank you. You may clap if you want. Thank you. Don't be shy. There you go. Oh. There we go. Please.
Thank you very much. My name is Torben Hansen. I come from an organization called Danish Agency for Data Supply and Efficiency. And if you ask who the hell are they, I can say that we are part of the what was formerly called the Danish Geodata Agency, which is a national mapping and cadastral agency in Denmark. So it was split into two, and 2/3 of the organization is now called this name. So I'm from a national mapping and cadastral agency. We are, in our organization, responsible for the implementation of Inspire nationwide. So we are coordinating with all the different bodies that are responsible for all the different themes. Plus, we are responsible for some of the data sets and also for making them available. So a lot of what I will say is based on the practical experience we have on implementation and use of the data. I really have two topics that I will talk about. One is coexistence of multiple frameworks for data sharing. One of the things we often hear when we talk about Inspire is that Inspire is a spatial data infrastructure. To be a bit provocative, I will claim it's not. Inspire is a framework for sharing and represents a view into the national spatial data infrastructure. And that, I think, is an important point. As you can see, or as it's illustrated here, there are different views on the same data, and Inspire is one of those views. And there are other views as well, and we need to take that approach to when we implement it. I know that Inspire doesn't put any requirement on how we implement it, so I'm pretty sure that everybody will agree this from a conceptual and a logical point of view. But I think it's also important to carry that approach on when we actually get to practical implementation. So that, because I don't think that we can implement parallel implementations of infrastructures to provide the data for the different data sharing frameworks. We need to be able to use the same infrastructure. The model we use in Denmark is that we always have production systems and distribution systems separate. That's architecture we have used for years. You can use best of breed for whatever data you maintain, and when you have maintained the data, you always then give the latest and greatest version into the distribution environment. So that's our basic architecture that we have had for many years. What we do is that we put up as a requirement for the data maintenance environment that they should be able to deliver the data in the most detailed form, which is it is our national e-government structure. So it's then replicated into the database schema with all the data that we have according to our distribution model. We work with temporality in our data. We actually work with bitemporality with our data, so we both know about registration and validity. So the first thing we do is that we start creating a view of the current data, because that's what most people are interested in. So we have the views here that we have on data, and then we implement the services that hook into these data. Okay. What do we do then? We set up a view where we actually then implement the view that corresponds to the Inspire schemas, application schemas, and set up the services that will support Inspire. And then we make other views as well. As you can see, it was on the current data because Inspire is only current data. The same, we are also the national mapping organization for military. So what we do is that we also set up views that will represent the NGIF application schemas that come from NATO. So we basically set up all the different frameworks for data sharing that needs to be supported. And as you can see, we develop our application schemas or JSON schemas, whatever. We haven't done that yet, but it could be done that way. And we manage them independent from each other, and then we make database views to support it. And then we put up the services on that database, and that can be SOAP services, it can be OTC with GML, it can be REST services. Actually, in our national e-government, a lot of the services are REST services, but they coexist, and it's just a tag, or they're just categorized as being Inspire or whatever. So that's our approach. You could have chosen other approaches. Some talk about extending Inspire and the data model, but in our opinion, that's not practical because we don't decide what are the application schemas for the rest. So we need to be able to handle those independently from each other. Actually, our sister organization, Danish Road Directory, started out doing Inspire extensions, but at a point in time they looked at it and put up pros and cons and went to the other approach. Really, I think that this is something that is very important for what the course that we get into is. So I think that it would be very nice if there were some recommendations that could be used on how to actually to do that. So that would be a recommendation. The other topic that I would like to cover is about how can we get it out to both geoprofessionals but also to mainstream ICT developers. My claim is we have no problems getting it out to the geoprofessionals. We have the services that are requested or required by Inspire, and that's perfect. All the geo-savvy people, they know how to do that, and they can make nice applications. Our real problem is what do we do with the mainstream ICT that are not geo-savvy? What can we do for those? And we have made an attempt to satisfy that need. So we did this V-stedet, show the location approach, and the goal we had was to give users a visual service and easy access to presentations map in an open source environment. So that it would be easy to overlay your own information on top of the shared government base map and geodata. So if we look at it with a well-known architectural picture on the bottom, you can see we put something on top of that would be the API that the mainstream ICT should use. I have a few examples. No, I have a few more bullets about what does it include. We have made it on Open Layers API, and we present WMS, WFS. We can overlay maps in KML, for instance. We can find areas of interest, and we can pan and zoom and so on. Just to show, illustrate this is the API that will be available, including a map on a web page, is basically these very few lines. The thing is that the main thing is it's a toolbox with JavaScript fragments that can be included in that API, and this is showing how you can use such a JavaScript fragments. Very simple, few lines to include it in a web page. This is an Ajax drop-down with event handler, so you can type in things and have suggestions on what do you mean. That's the very few lines that is needed for that. This is a drop-down again that will then give a location. It will position you correctly, and this is basically the very few lines that is needed to do that development. And we also have the last one, formatted WFS lookup, KML Atom, where you can use the WFS services and then format it, and this is formatted as an atom in atom format, and to do that you will have just these few lines. So basically the idea is take the complexity away and make these fragments and make them available. You can say, what's the problem? We did that. We actually, when you look into these examples, you will find they are from 2008, so it's on pretty old versions of Open Layers and so on. But and we gave it out, and it was very popular with the geo community. We still have a problem with the mainstream because they will ask who's responsible for this, who's maintaining this, and so on. We had hoped to give, when we gave it out, that there would be a community that would take care of it. That hasn't happened. We might try to go ahead with that again and make that happen. But because I think that what is preventing the mainstream from doing it is that they need an environment that they can trust, and this is as easy as the Google API. So I think that is needed is not a technical stuff. We need to take the other aspects of what is needed and address those. So credible community around some open source implementations, a well understood and accepted funding regime, communication about it, training, hackathons, and whatever. And this is really what I would like to discuss. How can we move along with something that will make it a lot easier to get hold of the mainstream developers?
I'm not Windows compatible, I guess. Great. All right, so I'll do the last of the three short what-if presentations for the discussion that we're having. And just to start so when at this precursor workshop in Delft, I also had a position paper that was basically focused on technical aspects and architectural aspects and the spatial data on the web best practices that are developed by W3C and OGC, and looked at certain aspects on how the architecture could be improved to make, for example, the things that Torben also mentioned. How can we make the data more easily accessible to the wider ICT community available? I won't go into much detail here. I actually, during the first session, I had a longer presentation about that topic. But just one aspect that I want to raise here, because that's also in a way relevant to what I will be talking about for the discussion items that I want to discuss today, is that I use the assumption here that we keep our infrastructure that we have basically in place, that we build on that we make use of that, but that we when we think about the evolution. We don't know where things are developing, and we don't fully understand how to actually optimally make it available. So we need to experiment and explore, and we can use proxies or other types of solutions. I think Torben has also presented that in some other way, going deeper to the database directly and then making the data available in other ways. As well, so that's for me the important assumption. So what I want to discuss briefly today is that it's related, but it's from a slightly different angle. So one of the conclusions from all these discussions, and I think also from the presentations that we have seen here and in many other sessions, is that what we really have is with Inspire is an infrastructure that requires GIS experts to make use of the data, so to create value-added services and tools. And at the same time, we do have the concerns by data providers about the required effort to meet Inspire requirements and publish their data sets. And one thing I want to discuss that with 2-3 slides, and then also discuss one idea is, okay, if that's the case, why don't we be practical and reduce expectations on data providers? Not all of them, but at least, let's say, if you have a municipality or a small, and it's very hard to actually have, you don't have the expertise or capacity to support the full requirements, why not be more lax and practical in that, because we have experts anyhow that need to look at that. So look at that, to briefly expand on these points is, so we actually, Inspire publishes data in 2 ways, and these are really extreme. So on one hand, it's the simple thing where you just download a file. And then we have the other extreme where you basically provide via the web, via HTTP, basically HTTP, a full access to a database. So that's actually two extremes, but that's really how you can access the data, there is no simpler way in between, for example. The other thing is, I think what Inspire is mandating is actually publishing the data as it is. So, and typically that's then the raw data that the domain experts use, or the organizations have the data because in order to support some business processes they have. It's not necessarily exactly the form that is easy for others, for users that don't have the same business processes, but want to use the data for some other topic. So that's another thing that we have. So, but the user, what he eventually is looking for is not the data itself, but something that creates value for him. So it dashboards, statistics, alerts, so event processing, maps, story maps where things get more interactive or actually tell a story, give some insights into something. So and we have a gap between where we publish the data and Inspire, but eventually we need to get there, and that's something that we haven't really addressed. I actually had a presentation about that topic 4 years ago at the Inspire conference, and I think basically what most of the things that I state here were stated there already. So we have to bridge that gap, but also our Inspire architecture actually has some limitations to effectively support these kind of users. And one is, if I download the files, one of the challenges that I then have is, let's say I have a larger data set, and I have no mechanism how I can understand how that data changes. So somehow I have to update my downloaded file if I want to keep it up to date, but we don't have any pub/sub mechanisms, etc. To keep up to date. So either I download it all the time, very frequently, and go through the processes. That's all not optimal for this if you download full files. The other thing then, if I go to the other extreme and not download the file but access it live, the database live, then we do have, so one thing is just the practical thing that can be overcome is that the level of service of many of the Inspire services aren't on a level that you would want to build an operational application on top of it. And the other thing then is, of course, you have many endpoints. So we have a distributed infrastructure, and if you have a pan-European application, you're talking to 30 services or even more if you have a federated structure. So that's then challenging for someone who builds an application. So I think of course could be simplified if data is cached in some central single point of access with certain guaranteed service level so that applications can reliably build on top of that. But that also requires the synchronization. The other point then that I raised in that overview is the data provider concern. So that's from that Inspire Fitness for Purpose activity. So mostly for the Annex 2 and 3, I think mainly for the Annex 3 theme. And there is that discussion ongoing. And so my thought about that is, to some extent, is so if we need GIS experts anyhow who have the technology and the tools and potentially the knowledge and understanding how to actually work with Inspire data, but then maybe also other GIS data, why not be more lax and just accept that data is provided as is if it's easier for them? And for open data, then it can also we can leverage the community if there is interest, member states or commission, to actually transform the data and publish that, for example, also in these centralized locations, but only, of course, where there is sufficient user demand. So that's probably, I mean, it's strictly not within the legal boundaries, but maybe since it's thinking about the box, I thought I'll raise that here as still. And in that context, also for Annex 3, just a reminder that what the directive, it's different for Annex 1 and 2. There are more requirements for these themes, but for Annex 3, the only things that are required strictly in the directive to be published is that you make the spatial objects, so the things available, classify them what they are, and provide where they are. That's the only things that are strictly required for Annex 3 in the directive. So these are the aspects that I would like to discuss and with you all here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I just helped organizing the process. The process would be as follows. We have almost three corners in the room. So let's say Torben goes to that corner and then collects with the team here for his ideas. Clemens stays in the middle. Okay, Clemens stays in the middle as the mediator between the topics also of Michael, who goes to that corner and collects with the team. So the idea would be that you team up with one of these three, discuss what is on the table in terms of recommendations and proposals, and build up to something that then can be wrapped up and discussed here and presented here at 12:15. So you have a bit more than half an hour to have these discussions. And no, you are not longer allowed to escape. No, you participate in the discussion. So knock the door.
Ich habe allerdings keinen Stift. Ich habe antiquierte Technologien. Morgen. Ich kann dann für mich selber diskutieren.
Ich diskutiere schon.
Wo bist du? Micha ist natürlich der interessanteste, weil wir mischen. All right. So how do we do that? Let me. Somehow I just need to make notes somehow. Well, maybe I just. That's very good. So, yeah, you've heard my presentation. Anybody has any comments or?
I was triggered by value-added services. I wanted to join Michael.
Discussing is
I'm triggered by value-added services and how Inspire in a way does not come up with basically making the business community and that they learn how to build data in it. So it's not that much picked up, then was pushed for.
we have done something that might not be
services that help people to grasp it.
and then the other thing was
there is a strong relationship with the functional analysis effectively, we can't ask the GIS expert to produce value-added services, not because they are build, but because most often they are in producers' organization. And so to introduce a data, I think they have to be in a medium position between the market, even the citizens, and the producers, to be more free to analyze this, the user's need, or the political need. The second point is, of course, it is all data produced by for analyzers, and of course, so the data has to be adapted to the final users. Usually we don't know how to do that when you are in the organization. From a cultural point of view, you are in the brain box. And you have to put the data out of the box to let people have imagination. At least,
Exactly. I mean, we didn't make sure that there was a community that sustainable, that
regulation,
There are certain users that need to
go outside the scope of the co-legislator will. So it is not a little thing, because in the huge democracy we have in European Union, the regulation don't have to go over the scope. So the one part of the competition is just because the legislator didn't want to do that. That because we have to consist on specialists, we went outside, so we made it very precise and smart that in fact, for a country like France, maybe contrary to the countries we don't know how many because there is very few assets produced like machine knowledge or covering systems.
Yes, we had the knowledge, but we would have been so much slower.
So the French analyzes it to produce API to publish data in a more acceptable way for users or middle users.
Data providers to agree on what these specifications.
Okay.
I think we might make things even more difficult another way of access.
You can publish raw data with complex interfaces, but the process is behind the rest of the interfaces because it's more user-friendly for them.
Yeah, the idea of the proxy argument is, of course, once you know something is very mature, we can
once you know
let's say integrate it more closely to the source. But I think to some extent, I don't know, Mark, your experience is also with APIs, we're still learning how we need to do it so that it works, and that gives us a lot of especially that we can experiment and learn before we just stronger states within firewalls.
But you can, it's not so difficult, you can create one source that when you build a chemistry.
In your description of your proposal process, does it
It is one thing I would like to add is that what we have seen last year with pilot project of wildfire
post-processing? Because the outputs
we had
existing services are not
UNC services support.
adequate.
That's not really well
Yeah.
developed.
And in terms of services,
almost in fact,
Well, it
by
can be.
developing a proof of concept, people really start thinking about
It can be, but to some extent, I mean, that's what we research, but so far we don't do that. Of course, we do some processes.
and also the political level
When we do it on the fly, generate the HTML, there is some mapping, just
by itself, and in the meantime it also
minimal.
boosts
I
the
think
development
what we will be
of
doing
data
at the
providers,
next
even
step
though
is actually to do more, because so you have
code is validated, you have building type 1,200, nobody will know what why are you done with it.
I think
Build, it's a shop or something like that. So it's understandable for the non-experts who are starting with the national
first 3 years of its
there is some process. I think it's to some extent a question of how far can you go that it's still
either update or real
I agree with that.
and that's for our mapping agency.
Super complex stuff.
We can close where we can
Something that we need to
be a leader.
Let me give you an example. I think one of the key things which we think of creating value is one of the big problems
Yeah,
of
we
our
should take violence and managing data and where everybody sees the benefit, we
still isolated.
bring
So
people together.
spatial data sets
Also develop
typically
something
are
with the
self-contained.
community
They
now.
are not really
that we
really
develop
related to
something
other
for the
data.
community.
But to create value, you need to relate your data to other data. So that means
That
the
is
web content with
elaborate
hyperlinks.
so many
Well,
cases.
we don't have that in the data. So one thing that I'm also exploring
You
is
could never
actually do that
reach
dynamically,
with
query other
just
data to
saying
find
let's
related
do
data
this,
and show that also then
because
in the
you're
data that
already
you
saying
provide.
you must do that.
Of course, then if you do that with
Never
many other
happens,
data,
but then it really
then there is a
becomes
performance.
a matter
So
of
then
life.
there are limits to that, and I think part of it is also
Maybe
educating
the best would be that things that
data
we develop is
providers
also
in what they should do in addition,
you-
so that their data
so that
is not only valuable to their
maybe
business
people
process,
then
but it's also
more
easier to
they
provide.
can also use your tool even though it's still a proof of concept. They can build on it and maybe it's something about schools, some really other things. So maybe someone else did on other topic, build also something like that. But then we can use that because we can only invest time in 1, 2, 3 projects and then that's it. So there must be some kind of community maybe.
Maybe we should provide that to people in Weimar.
I understand that that was done
We
on
had
the
a
API
meeting on the
that's all
desk
provided.
international meeting we were discussing about
The base map already exists.
but somebody else
Both web
interface.
we built a web interface.
They said if I need a map, I'll ask
Bring
my
together image data. We also
meet that was a shop in Iowa.
on all governmental levels. They were in
But I was looking at some of the data actually there.
They didn't bring in another simpler API.
Sorry. No, I'm just,
Yeah, it was a
for
simple.
me it was a big eye opener.
It was already existing
Yeah, okay, there.
we developed a little bit of
My conclusion, being not the expert on the domain of provide services,
So this API can,
It's not direct.
when
in fact, it was used
there was put a second for the regulation or in the text of the line
People
But,
also that they have
just
or
already
also
existing
everything
product
in
which
terms of
can also
and so
be improved.
for me then it
And
becomes priority to solve
I mean, you don't have to continue with
problems
that,
of
it's just
inspire
an improvement
what
of
is
something and it also makes people think about, okay, maybe I can use
which
some
is
other
to have the services
delivery
in the
today.
available
So just plant some small seeds
because
that
we have
will
2020
can
and
grow to
probably even further
to
because
bigger
Germany is already having the
So
number
providing
of
examples, but
local services available.
Yes.
I don't see if you have 21 or you don't have your interoperability then we have this. So practically speaking, I think the priority for national data as is available with the new and download services, what needs to be done on top of what exists and what needs to be changed. If technical people consider there are things that needs to be changed, and what also what needs to be provided, maybe availability for delivery services is very, very much crucial. Now, another point, and that's all there, how we see so the traditional way of administration reform the business is nowadays changing, and there is no way to see that is happening. And when we say that once organized means that within the public administration it needs to be data available to service in a way that someone is doing and another one is picking up what already done, we are not confused. success stories, just tell about regions that share the efforts making great service and make the data available, and at the same time the business model for data, so how to share, is there any lessons, yes, no, all these things. So I think from that point of view, we have
for free, the API is used for free.
therefore be able to show benefits and make the things progress, but without showing benefits, everybody says that's not make available resource. Seriously, what is the
So
constraints
you
that
can
we
have
should
great
get?
API,
Then
you
if they
have done user
constraint
requirements,
themselves
this is a user
to make
API
the
can
things
provide
available, there to be
some money.
the possibility to get every service from them, because inside, as I said, inside even the public administration, the business service is changing already nowadays. And inspired
What I get is that we are actually talking about three levels. We have the API or the services that
and
we
we
have.
also heard that the technical process are not always the most important to solve, but although being not the most important, they need to be solved anyhow, otherwise things doesn't work. And as your proposal,
Middle layer, I would like to
very good, apart from the single and extreme, of course it's already there, and it's
allow us to get into it.
So on the technical part, I mean, I think I raised three aspects which I think are important to make it happen. And the APIs, so the middle thing between download and full access to the database, which also is, let's say, performance security, all these concerns. So the other thing is also access to many endpoints of varying quality, so the question of whether without this central access point that cache the data and make it available at certain service levels, this is not really required by the
there's a lot of material already for the other questions, but I think I would still like to
measure,
want
the
to
third
take
is
one, and we already
for
have
those
that.
who actually want to
How do we
perform tracking,
changes
how to get information about changes in the data.
already said if you do measure then the other example.
Anything
How do you actually
manage
manage if I look at
The last point, if I understood what you meant,
with them, how you collect it.
if you update your data, the atom feed is away, like it's easy to go to professional update.
Yeah, but the problem there is, let's say, I use the French address data. Addresses are changing frequently. Let's assume it wouldn't be updated just every half year, but it would be updated weekly or something like that. It doesn't help me to learn, okay, there is a new data set, and I have to download again 10 gigabytes of data and merge it into my local data store. Right? So it would be better if I just get the information about this change 50 addresses. I mean, that's one thing.
Just update the data instead of the database.
Exactly. I mean, incremental updates, pop-ups, and it's quite frequently also used actually on the web, so you have all these mechanisms that use webhooks, etc. that you can use when something changes, something else is triggered. So you can actually, you don't have to actively monitor that, but it helps someone it's a challenge. That's a challenge on the data provider, potentially if they don't use that kind of mechanism for their internal systems. But it's for value-added services. If you build something in your own environment and you want to upon something that's up-to-date, then it's an important
People complain of this business community, complain about these things regarding this aspects of negative aspects of framework.
That's indeed the way,
Inspire,
we should find a
we would
way
say in Inspire there isn't that much of
bring us people together to
already. It's mostly because
Osteo, for instance, is an organization where we have already a lot of developers together in phosphor conferences,
most of the time
talking to each other, and the things I learned there is that people are checking information from the village to work together. What we have to do is to how we can reuse all that positive energy to create the vision, to create something that everybody wants to work for. And then
My point would be, as I said, to
sponsor
attract
that
more business
information
to
system
even
is
exploiting
going
and
to
helping
pay,
us
and
exploiting
it can be
inspired data. They should look for themselves which kind of value they create and where they get that value. But they are creation.
But I know for national value, so at the end of the day, we should have everything should get happy. That's my same in the Netherlands and the UK.
No, your point is right. But like to those major
build
like grow and grow. If you doing and do of this providing of megatons of megabytes of data.
Do you need any kind of government in some sort of?
Nothing. And why is
Interesting issue there with those kind of what you mentioned that there's some other sectors outside the GM, businesses that are very successful
is going to full.
Before I answer this question, I have a second question.
They change the processor. They give up NVIDIA to produce their own processors so that they have to
Projects, and I was in a workshop about
they need data.
and in that workshop I have the ambition to create a single just one the problem is more based technology base.
So they
I see there is the project is now finished, and now they want to build community. They will not build community, I can assure you.
So I don't imagine one moment that Google will never use that for something.
That is the problem.
By supply, they don't use that to scrap the request, for example. They have to use on the question table.
So I think we should working
we have experiments
to build
3 or 4 years ago.
and
I say we don't have to let the door now. I say we have to open the door to people code. The first problem to have data, to have value to data, is to find capacity. In France, it doesn't work. On Geoportal, it doesn't work. In Germany, so for large organizations, thousands and thousands of data sets. First problem, users
we have a lot of challenges
do not
going
find
on
the
top
data
of us,
set.
and we
And
can't
so all the architecture of
software
benefits
that we are creating again and again and again.
goes down because you don't find the set.
we interpret your
If you spend 2 times the time the set,
you have different formats,
where is
maybe
it? And so
20 times more people
from
download
my point of view, before to deal with it, I do it great concept. The subject for is to be able to find the right data set among 30,000 or among 100,000.
The problem of this, I mean, just talk some, we know that when the additives not enough. But at that point, considering the service has to improve, to apply service and so on.
But everybody knows this.
Shall we still see as metadata as it is, or shall we see and then talk about the services that are able to charge all the metadata, or shall we the other way around? From the service point of view or from the metadata? Because in Inspire we have bottleneck metadata, and I don't know if the bottleneck, but constraint or whatever with service. What goes first?
It's just a controversial view, but this is just they change it all the time.
And of course, so they have an issue also with licensing.
I'm not saying it's easy, I'm just saying, is it worth the money that everybody is spending their own time on the
There's still a long way to go.
when everybody at the end of the day wants to have
there
a permanent data on this topic,
it's just too complex, it's not variable by the average user. This is for me to some extent
And but it's a difference between development and
yeah, exactly. And I'm listing open this
So what you're saying is that a question of whether we should pick one API or the other
solution, but
no, I'm not saying you pick one of
about
them.
But I certainly agree on the metadata.
First of all, the core for anything.
When you want to do searches, then
And I
search
think
engine
that
is
is probably
personal, and that's basically schema.org and to some extent I'm not sure about DKIC, but
on something to have a community.
the search engine is starting to also DKIC. So only the
this is a very, very positive
It's not a popular as a European body, you might have some cloud data.
I think that there will be position, and that is that if we the data and also share data on the platform and then I think that all data is metadata, so that because that's the issue. The reason why
going to your question of
no,
which end we
because it's
I think the point
data. We also need the platform
and
for
that's what I actually that's what I tried to
social
do in
data
the morning's presentation. So
social
the title we need to think end-to-end, we need to think this whole value chain and not science implementations that inspire. So we have why we have the implementation challenge and certain tools are the ways to relate this, and then we have to but when we have to think how we get to something
If the commission
to the applicant's value. And I'd like to make a comment that we do have data that are open at the point of view. I think we have come over some of the topics about how we keep the I think we are not actually one of the topics we're following right now. We have our access and people that are use access. And they are pushing very hard for us to allow our agreements with all the different providers of the navigation systems. They need to use the latest and greatest. Actually, the first step on our in our door when we use Google and it's great that they do it. Question I thought, can we rely on a specific we also need to do something
what can we do?
that's not it's open well you have open like it's free like it's free beer or free speech. It's like a free speech I think.
The services to the metadata of the service.
You sitting here is a cost, and somebody's paying for it. That you are sitting here. So there's nothing
Are the services
time that is costing money.
As I said, we still we are national map and that's
so I think the one is really
but we remove all cost recovery from
keep the same line with metadata.
so we need to make funding from somewhere else.
And at the other hand, the costs that we pay is just an agreement so that we can exchange some services. That's a
Yeah,
good
to be honest, I'm not a big fan of the metadata standards that we have. So I think they are they're not the biggest, but they are a thing. I didn't really address that. It's something that we
It's been on the go for many years now. I've worked with another
if we talk about directions, it's very simple things. For example, it's a spatial data infrastructure. So what are we interested in? There's nothing, right? So people are using looking for
And they get free mapping use while they're
they're
using
looking for data sets.
and we have now managed to encourage
How
all
is
not
data
to services at all. They just use the business
It's coming from the service to the data set. So
within our organization, we are not allowed data to
arbitrary links to other things.
we must use our own
But it doesn't say what the semantics of these links are. Actually, if you find the data set, there's no mechanism that allows you for clever naming your link from
when you find
whatever we have. what is where you download it. Why create the conflict? I mean, it's direction.
Because they can start over the course of
None of these are designed for work. Oh, yes. It's a mixed bag, so there are some things that they can focus on. That's the stuff that we're if you can overcome it by... The applicator is great, except when you put automation there, that's a problem. Denmark has the deeper, for example... But the question is, how do you resist your application directly if you interchange because there is a range of
but I also see those proxies and push different views. It doesn't change anything on the original data, but it just adds another layer.
We don't take profit from the huge semantic and relations we have in the data. That's why it looks useless, because from one side,
in our own work, yes, we actually measure it. We have duplicated just about everything, and we have balance, load balancing on the front that will have all over situations.
7 days, 24 hours.
Yes. We actually monitor it and we publish it, and we are normally there. But actually, we have our very basic data program where we actually
What is it?
do have the
convincing.
Go to, let's say, testing first, and then...
So reliability, yes. I agree.
I think the motion is to organize work program in light for the target that's why I think we still have a lot of freedom to do those things.
Just as a reminder, we have 5 more minutes to discuss. 5 more minutes.
first time
why don't we do it
that
on
we're
the real
talking about
translation,
like in the middle
23
layer,
languages.
not something you can see in the browser.
I think the semantics will be very
Client
interesting
software for something.
for the next step
Don't
of
you think that should be your focus to provide this as well?
Can these things be made practical?
Maybe a little bit answer the media. Let's hope that some action can work with provide is an API and let in private contractors to
That's what I was wondering about. It goes in the center. I mean, from Google Maps, it's roughly clear. You want to have a kind of generic map. It's also clear what is not controlled.
But either it's you have the feeling that it's already out of the box that can go and use, or you have the feeling that it's other test, or you have another option is to see what is most already in use in the senses. Therefore, if you put as a best practice something that is already known by the producer, but not the producer, then it's quicker to get results. And have a kind of, from one side, win-win, and from another one, at the same time, probably be
geographical data provision. And I think
best
I think, I was going to say, I hear from a number of people now that it's probably okay to pay for data, and
there is a way
they want their service, they can make it.
create a link between special
That's what I'm hearing. So, but it is important, but it is important initially
projects
will
for
have
that. I forgot to think about the semantics in the UFS.
that's what I
There,
heard.
and this is the time now that we
And so in the future, that's why I have been using some consultation this week is to be able to read it.
but that's the responsibility of
Non-special data on
stable society, and then the private industry will adapt and I don't see any problem there.
We don't work with data, so.
But I think it's also the point that I made exactly yes, I think the value there is still value audio semantics that we definition of operation 24 languages. But it doesn't necessarily the technology that there's probably there are other ways
That's the specific
In 10 years, imagine in 10 years,
it's something that could be explored. We never built it. We have an application. We didn't provide a program where we could work with private companies, but not so much now. So we can work free in the application that are not on us, and it requires more work. That's clearly the case. I mean, that's here the original.
Please do provide minimal
Please, try to finish.
We do it. But one that in general knows, we still need to be an expert on to do that.
Yeah, try to get finished. Think about your wrap up.
It was just
we will have good implementations only where we will have strong Euro, and we will do that. On the other part, if you are not strong in Java, you don't have to do this.
Preferably link into some of the community.
So where is the place where the you will be so it is
Make sure that the
yeah, that's why I initiated 14 years ago. People Inspire as a framework. We have nothing to change. The way they reach the people. Again, from one end to the other.
We discussed a bit with different views again.
So, yeah, you are finished now. I mean, Michael is already doing the reporting over there, so you could do that already up front. So then, let's talk and have a bit of time to get organized.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Michael, are you feeling prepared to begin, or?
Not really.
Okay, you begin.
Okay. I'm gonna try and make a summary. Actually, I think I didn't do a very good job at coming to recommendations at the end. We had quite a big group and a lot of contrasting views, I would say. And so basically, I'll try and report and wrap up on what we came up with. Don't look at the slides so much because they haven't been really cleaned up. So looking at the users, who they are, we had a lot of discussion on that. There was a useful categorization from the Netherlands saying that there's basically, they have four categories. Two are more direct users, data and map users, and two are more indirect users or developers, so that would be business developers and more ICT developers. I think we had a feeling that it is the real users that we may want to focus on are more the developers that are building applications on top of the data, because they are basically really needed in order to bridge the gap between the data and the services that we have in Inspire and the actual end users sitting in public administrations, sitting in businesses and so on. What else did I have here? Oops. Okay, and the other thing is that we said the communication is very important. There were, again, slightly different views on how the communication should be done, whether we really need to have targeted communication towards specific groups, or whether it's enough to have excellent communication, and maybe we don't, if it's really good, we don't need to be specific to a specific user group. I'm not 100% sure I wouldn't agree with that, but I think it was clear that it was important to communicate. One thing that was said is that one approach, rather than saying we need to speak a different language to explain what Inspire is, we could also try and educate people, and that was the example of Poland, that basically had a big training program a number of years ago, training 4,500 people in the public administrations about Inspire and making them more aware. And that is basically the other way to do it, and say, like, let's try and make people more aware of what Inspire can offer to them. On the other question on how to get feedback from users, again, there were slightly different views on whether we really need feedback from users. There was some that said, we're just counting the number of users that are using our data and services, and if the numbers go up, our funding agencies are happy. So we don't really need that feedback loop, and we don't need registration and really knowing who our users are. Whereas others said it's important to actually get feedback, both on the on which data are more interesting than others, but also on really more detailed feedback to the data provider, saying, okay, there's something wrong here in the data, maybe you want to fix that, or could you provide this in a different format that I would need, and so on. The question on how to actually get that feedback channels, we had a bit of a discussion on whether we should follow the kind of Amazon and others platform approach. Some said absolutely not. As soon as you require some login for users, you will basically build a new barrier. So let's try and not have that. And by the way, we don't even have that kind of central platform that we could use. Others said things like social media platforms can be very useful. And maybe there could be a mixed approach where you have free access for browsing and accessing the data. But if you want to have additional benefits on providing your feedback or getting additional information, being notified about updates and so on, then only then you need to log in and provide your user credentials and so on. Okay, again, we said it's also important, if we don't have a central platform, it's important that the value-added applications that people build for us, developer build for us, that they include feedback functions. So it's rather than getting the feedback directly through the data, it's important that the value-added application actually directly there in it has a way to provide feedback that then goes back to the data provider. So people will not go to a different system to provide feedback. They will only do it if it's really easy, one click, and that is maybe something that we can learn from the Google Maps and others as well. And then we had a bit of a discussion about funding, and that is related to showcasing benefits. Some said that basically the one way to really show whether data is valuable is to make people pay for it. Because if you see people pay, they will see that it is. You will see that it's beneficial. That was a bit of a controversial discussion about that. Others said that it's important to give at least initial access to data for free, and then maybe have a kind of a freemium model where you have some basic access for free, that you can try out the data, you can experiment with it, see if you want to build your business on top of that, and only then when you really turn it into a real business, you maybe have to pay for additional features or different additional things that you can do with it. And I think that was largely it. We also said that it would be useful to actually have a data browser, not just a portal where you see the data sets, but actually better viewers where you can actually explore the data and work with the data better. Anything I forgot? Or misrepresented?
Well done, Michael.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I've used the classic approach to take notes, so I'll just read a few things out. Try to organize the discussion we had, which was a very lively discussion, and we jumped back and forward a bit, but I'm trying to organize it in a kind of logical way. I'll wrap it up later on. First of all, we seem to agree that this is not a technology issue. We should, however, probably look into how can we add some rest on top of what we are already obliged to do. But it's not a technology issue. What we should do is engaging with the domains and the developers. We have three levels of interaction that we need to handle. We have the interaction with those that actually use our current API. Then we have this easier to approach API which is probably a JavaScript API, and then there are also somebody who needs to have the GUI to actually look into. But we, in the continuation, we focused on the middle one, the easy-to-use API, the JavaScript API. It's important to engage with both the domains that need our stuff, but especially with the developers. and developers, as Michael just said, seem to be the key to this. We should provide examples on how to use our stuff. We should, and we also talked, who are the developers? Who are we talking about? Are we talking about our own developers? Are we talking about other government developers? Are we talking about private business developers? And we talked about it's very important to be clear on the roles and on the business model. And I think that we had different approaches in the different countries. I think that what I heard, Poland and Northern Ireland are very much into government-to-government cooperation on this and these topics, whereas I heard that both the Netherlands and Denmark are seeing the private companies, the private businesses as a very key player in how to get this stuff developed. Then, how do we actually move on? As we said, it's not a technology thing. This is something about how do we actually make it work. We should create a community that will include both government and private businesses, and we should make it attractive to cooperate. We should include existing communities, because there are communities handling this already locally. We should try to work with those, agree on platforms, and agree on rules for how to hook into these platforms. One discussion, we should also make some recommendations on how to do the funding. One of the topics that we probably need to work more on is how do we governance this, because we should not end up in a situation where everything is just poured down into some place and nobody can find out what's useful. So there needs to be some governance about what is the platform, which functions does it contain, and so on. So that's something that needs to be worked out, but that's not an unknown problem in the open source environment. Other topics that were mentioned is licensing of data is an issue. So that is a separate issue that needs to be dealt with. There was also a statement about why don't we just use Google, and that also gave some discussions on can we rely on Google only, or should we I mean, if it's open, it's obviously something that also needs to get into Google and other environments. But do we need something that is independent also of proprietary things? So that was a discussion itself. And then final remark is that when we get into this, if we want to be successful, we also need to be very careful about the reliability of the environment we provide, because if it's not reliable, it's no need at all.
Thanks. Well done. Thanks, Torben. It looked like you had more time than we did. You had time to discuss a lot of things. I have to say sorry for Lars, who had to leave to catch his train, but I think I'll try to wrap up for him. Please, Clemens.
Okay, yeah. So let me try to get something coherent out of our discussion. So yeah. Basically, I think what we started is looking at the analysis that I did and see what other views there is. And in general, there was support for the points that I've raised. And in addition, one of the things that was mentioned also in addition that we need to, when we look at what Inspire does or where we come from and where we should go, is that we also need to understand that it's not only that the world outside is changing, but also all the business processes are changing also within our community for all the organizations, so the data providers, etc. And we need to take that into account as well. And I think the key thing that was discussed is really how do we create value or value-added services to make that more concrete. But essentially, that's again the question: is how do we get the stuff to the user? How do we get that to the user? And when we then looked at some of the more specific aspects, so in general, this idea of having a layer on top, so the proxy idea, so that we can do experimentation, that's a nice idea that gives us some flexibility without being too disruptive necessarily. But we also need to be aware of course, it also has some limits. So, for example, if the distance between what we have and where we think we need to go to in experiments becomes too complex, the processing, it doesn't really work to do that on the fly. So there may be a performance hit, the more complex that is. And there are also other things that I mentioned, like this subscription thing pops up, or getting information about changes, or some of the metadata issues that we also discussed. Somehow you always end up discussing metadata. They need more deeper architecture changes to actually address. You can't just solve that by a layer on top. But in a sense, the proxy already is kind of a value-added service because it provides the data to some other community. So it is that already. And the three measures, technical measures that I mentioned, in a way, so the PubSub, also the idea of centralizing access with, let's say, guaranteed reliable services, service that you can have service level agreements, and also providing access to data somewhere in between the full download and the full database access. So simpler APIs, more following the spatial data on the web approaches. These were all considered to be useful things to consider when we think about the evolution of Inspire. One of the things that we were asking then that also ended up us looking at metadata is how do we need to think about the processes? Where do we start and where do we go to? Do we think from metadata and what we do from there, or do we need think about the service and think back to metadata? And I think it's that's a valuable point. So and I think also with the title of the my pitch was more that we need to think end to end. So basically, we need to think from the starting point of where the data providers are to the point where you get the result that provides some value. We need to think along that chain. And one of the issues that I mentioned that is in that discussion is that, for example, in the metadata, the direction of the linkages is not always right. So people are interested in data and not in services, but the relationship goes from the service to the data. So it's the other way around, actually. If you find the data set metadata, there's no clear mechanism to get to the data. So you can't follow the processes as most people think about. And also as time evolves, metadata also changes. You can derive, or we should be thinking about deriving all the metadata that we can automatically derive. That's not all. There's stuff that we can't derive, but a lot of the information is actually derived from the data, and we should do that. I mean, that's what's happening a lot with all the big data, machine learning, artificial intelligence, etc. You analyze the things and you try to abstract what you actually need out of it. And that's also what then other users are using, also the businesses. They might be harvesting the data. One of the key assets that we have in Inspire and that we are not really exploiting sufficiently is, I think, the body of knowledge that we have in all these semantics that are captured in the models, also since we have it multilingual, we have it in 23 languages, we have clear links, that it's an important body of knowledge, and that is not really exploited at the moment. And I think that is something that might deserve also more thinking on how we can make better use out of that. And then the other thing is also regarding is have things changed since Inspire was designed, or can we have less harmonization? And maybe some technologies help in doing that, also with the semantic body, etc. And I think we're clearly not there. Technology is clearly not there, but it may evolve in that direction. But it's important to understand, since we think it from the end, we should focus on harmonization really only where there is a clear user need to do it. Yeah, I think that was basically the points. And if someone has any additions or corrections, please feel free.
Thanks, Clemens. Thanks, everyone. With that, I'd like to close the session. Maybe just to say, if you're interested in any follow-up, being in touch with us, please make sure that your email is on these pieces of paper. If you haven't signed up, please do so now. This is our first try in keeping track of our users. So what we will do probably is to try, and I would ask the presenters to kind of send us a short summary of their findings in a text or in a few slides, so that we can use that as a starting point. And we will probably continue the discussions online. Maybe through the semantic clusters, we will probably put some of the discussions up there and try to continue, because obviously we didn't have enough time in this half an hour to really discuss all the topics exhaustively. So we will try and do that and trying to come together to to some conclusions and maybe some concrete next steps that we can pick up, and also draft this paper that we want to write on the future vision. So thanks again a lot on this. If you want to provide us feedback on the format, please do so as well. Just send us an email if you liked it or not, or what ideas you have in doing that in a different way if we do it in another time. And I wish you a successful, nice rest of the conference. Thank you.